Alright, this is the last video for this week. So I drove out to campus today, and about halfway through I realized that I guess I'm instituting Casual Friday. Forgot to put on a shirt today. I didn't have any face-to-face classes. So, hopefully you're not offended by the sweatshirt. Gotta get work done when you can. So the last thing that we're going to talk about in the context of population is the carrying capacity. This is a term I mentioned a couple of times in some other videos. And it's actually kind of an ecological idea, right? So we're gonna apply it to the human population, of course, most interesting. But really, this is an idea that's been around for a long time, and people have been alarmed about it for a long time. And it didn't necessarily come out of the study of human populations. It came out of really kind of in the realm of ecology or biology. So you can see here, this is a picture of a famous British thinker. He was running around in about the 1750s, plus or minus, by the name of Thomas Malthus. And what Thomas Malthus did, well, he actually did quite a few things. He's a famous British thinker. He studied populations, among other things. One of the things he's most famous for is actually he noted that, you know, on a farm, if you have a whole bunch of chickens, there's a higher percentage of chickens born than reach maturity, meaning the ones that are the strongest and the best, or the best at getting food, tend to continue on. So reading Thomas Malthus's work gave inspiration both to Charles Darwin, famous guy, and Alfred Russel Wallace, similar impact, less famous guy, and really their study of evolution, right? You know, Darwin published on Origin of Species, describing how populations change. Really, Malthus was the first person that noted that, but in a kind of controlled environment. Malthus's contribution to what we're going to talk about was this notion of capacity. So if you have an environment, your environment has a certain amount of resources produced. The most simple way to think about it is food, right? How much food is there? And so as a new organism enters that environment, it starts consuming that resource, and its population grows because everyone's fat and happy, right? There's food everywhere, everyone's munching down, having lots of babies. It's a grand time. But the good times don't last forever, right? So you can see here, this is the kind of the distillation of Malthus's idea, and population is growing, right, as a response to this excess resource. But population grows, and you can kind of think it in a sense that it develops momentum, right? It continues to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow without necessarily reflecting the limitations placed on that environment by their resources or how much food there is. Again, I'm using food as a substitute. You know, resources are a little more complicated than that. So there's this kind of called Malthusian crisis point where those two lines cross, right? And so if there is no food, this line can't continue upward, even though that's the trajectory. And so it really predicts what they call crisis, right? So all of a sudden, your population's way too high, and lots of things are going to die. So, you know, so this notion has been around for, you know, at least 250 years. We've refined it a little bit. You can see here, these are three graphs that are a little more theoretical, right? And they don't, at least two of them don't necessarily reflect how organisms behave, ourselves included in that. So you can see in this first one, if there's a limit, there's what we would call the capacity for that ecological environment. Or, you know, we could expand that ecological environment to mean the globe, right? The resources available to us on the globe. And what you see here is population rises, 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 and then abruptly plateaus at the capacity. So that's not realistic, right? That's basically everyone sitting around saying, oh, we have just the right amount of people to balance our resources. Everyone can only have, you know, zero population growth from here on, right? The whole 2.1 babies per mama. It's impossible to have that foresight, right? And there's too many moving parts in our environment for us to fully kind of dial in on what we think the carrying capacity is. The second diagram is a little more close to reality, but still requires an incredible amount of foresight, which we don't necessarily see, at least on our scale. So here, again, population's rising, but population senses the resources are getting close to running out, and you can actually see that slow kind of change in population, and then plateau right at the carrying capacity. So that would, be a similar situation if, the scientists or the researchers were saying, okay, everyone, we're coming up against tough times. We're going to run out of resources. Let's lay off having children. Let's reduce our fertility rates, and let's slowly throttle this thing and land our planes safely right at carrying capacity. So again, it's a great model. It's not. It's totally idealized, right? It doesn't necessarily reflect, again, human nature. So first of all, we don't like to be told what to do, right? Someone tells you, no more babies. That's not going to be good enough. So this third segment of this diagram is kind of the applied or the observational reality of this limit, right? This carrying capacity, which you can see is shown in a dashed line in all three of these diagrams. And so population grows and grows and grows, and at least the first portion of this diagram actually looks similar to the Malthusian diagram we looked at, where population rips right on past the production of resources. And so here, population overshoots, right? So we have what we call overshoot. And again, this is something we see in ecology all the time. You introduce, deer to a new environment, or it's really easy to model it with animals, right? Because they consume resources, and when you think about bunnies, right, reproducing, and eventually they run out of food, they overshoot, and then we end up in crisis. And so, again, kind of mathematically, we've got that overshoot, and then all of a sudden we have a significant drop in population that undershoots, and over time, hopefully this kind of yo-yoing effect where we overshoot, undershoot, that then becomes the plateau, right? The plateau is not necessarily going to be just flat. So we'll just take a second and look at this, a different version of this third diagram. Right here you can see this a little more clearly. It's got carrying capacity. It also has the idealized curve, right? The one where everyone's listening and really paying attention and limiting their population growth. But also it includes this overshoot. Another thing that can happen that this diagram doesn't exactly show is that during that overshoot portion, the resources that are available can actually be overconsumed. If we think about renewable resources, like a forest, right? So if you need so many kind of units of forest to survive, if you overshoot, the forest actually might disappear, right? And so the limit, right, the capacity, the carrying capacity may actually take a negative dive itself, right? So here the dashed line is shown as a plateau, as a flat plateau, simplified model. Quite a few other more sophisticated models show that as a result of that overshoot, the dashed line itself could drop down and reduce the carrying capacity because those resources were overused or extinct, right, in some cases. All of these diagrams that we've been talking about have been dodging one fundamental question, especially with context to humans on planet Earth. What is Earth's carrying capacity in the context of human beings? Meaning, what's the maximum population that can survive on Earth before we reach this overshoot and crisis mode, right? Again, the Malthusian crisis. Well, as I hinted before, it's not so straightforward. There are a lot of moving parts. So, agriculture and land use and a lot of those issues can control the amount of food we produce. Again, I'm substituting food for resources, right? Or I'm really dramatically simplifying. There are a lot of different numbers that people come up with. Again, it's not necessarily black and white. Some people suggest 40 billion or 45 billion. These numbers that most people would think is absurd. The first thing that we should look at when we think about carrying capacity is what is our land use, right? What are these resources that we're thinking about? So we can look here. This is a map of the U.S. Again, it's kind of an infographic mixed with a map, and it shows these blocks that are relative to the percentage of land that we have for different uses. There's a couple of interesting things that you can see. So first of all, cattle, right? That's the big one in the middle. But also you can see, we dedicate a certain percentage of our land to golf courses down in the bottom right. Percents devoted to defense. You can see timberlands on here, and those timberlands are subdivided, federally, privately owned, and owned by corporations. Those are actually some things that have been in the news Idaho lately, the selling of our timberlands to individuals rather than big companies such as Boise Cascade. So the takeaway from this is we dedicate an incredible amount of land to producing food for animals, right? So that's actually two different blocks you can see here. So there's the food we eat, which is a small portion, the food we grow for animals, which is larger, about almost 3 times the size, and then the land that we have dedicated to animals. And taking grain, which produces a certain amount of nutrition, and using that to grow protein in the form of animal protein, right, meat, using it to grow steaks, let's simplify, right? That's an incredibly inefficient use of those grains, right? And so something that you may have come across, or something that maybe came up in the carbon production assignment or the carbon calculator assignment, was the notion that if you just are eating a vegetarian diet, the amount of land dedicated to your consumption and your the chemical reactions that sustain you eating, it's much smaller, right? So you have a much smaller carbon footprint if you're not consuming meat, which is an incredibly inefficient way to do that. I like steaks, I've got to say. And I think I mentioned this in a previous video, I'm not exactly sure. One of the things to do is just to really be aware of that, right? So you can have meatless Mondays, or only eat meat 3 days a week, or, again, you can eat it until the cows come home. But eventually the cows won't come home, right? Because they will all have been eaten. The last concept I want to talk about in the context of carrying capacity of Earth is, we mentioned, some people put some numbers out there, 40 billion. I think that's a little bit far-fetched. Most people, again, kind of hovering around, probably 12 to 13 billion, Again, it's not so straightforward. Probably somewhere in there is about as much as we can handle. But in the last segment, or in the last little diagram that we were looking at, we saw that, well, we don't use our land with efficiency in mind, right? We use our land with what we want to eat in mind, which isn't necessarily the best use of land. So this is absolutely unrealistic, but if the planet were to convert to vegetarianism, that's the first example of a way that the carrying capacity of the Earth can be modified, right? We can change the carrying capacity through a couple of different things. This would be an example of changing it through behavior, right? So if we all didn't eat meat, again, I'm not going to go without my steak, so don't get me wrong. Or it's starting to be springtime barbecues around the corner, hamburgers, I'm excited. But if we all consumed less meat, that means there's more land available to grow food that's less land intensive. So again, we would have a lower draw on the food resource, and our carrying capacity would, as a response, be higher. Food is key, right? And food production, as we saw, is something that really has an effect on our global carrying capacity. I mentioned, obviously, vegetarianism changes the capacity. That's probably outside of the realm of reality, right? So when you're coming up with solutions, it's great to come up with all these theoretical ones, but they have to work, right? And so that's a solution that really would need a lot of global buy-in, and I'm not sure that that's possible. Food production, though, isn't necessarily a kind of a one-trick pony. So in particular, kind of the best success story of this is actually, if we look to the Netherlands, right? So the Netherlands is a small country famous for wild times in Amsterdam and tulips and windmills and all these great things. The Netherlands is kind of beautiful, you know, agrarian, bucolic countryside. You think back to the paintings of many of the great northern European artists, particularly Vincent van Gogh. It's beautiful countrysides and starry, starry nights and all this stuff. Although I think maybe that was painted in France, but yeah, not too far from the Netherlands where he was from. But they have revolutionized farming, and so you can see here, if you look at food produced per country, you know, a lot of the countries here you can see are, you know, pretty standard ones you'd expect. You know, harkening back to earlier lectures, more land means more food production. But the Netherlands is tiny and produces a large amount of food, and they do it in a really unique way. So if you were to look down on the Netherlands in Google Earth or some other program similar, you would see, you know, patterns of patchwork farms that look very similar to many other countries. But when you start to zoom in, you realize they aren't farm fields at all. They're massive, you know, 20 or 30 foot tall greenhouses, so 2 or 3 story greenhouses that occupy the same footprint as a traditional farm field. And so farmers there are producing, or way overproducing food per square footage, or per square foot, because they're farming indoors. That allows them to extend their growing season, obviously. It reduces the need for space, right? So you can, they have in some cases tomatoes that are grown, you can see here, these are kind of like vertical conveyor belts that will move crops around, so you can also pick them, and then so they're not just growing things on the ground, they're growing things vertically. It reduces the need for soil. Largely this is done in a hydroponic sense, meaning they take water and cycle it through a medium, and they add nutrients to that water, and they monitor that water coming out, and they figure out how many nutrients the plants are using, and the plants grow, so they're not consuming soil. Pests, so if you have a greenhouse, a controlled environment like this, you don't necessarily have to use as many chemicals that are going to be, you know, detrimental, right? You don't have to rely on using Roundup and a kind of Monsanto Roundup ready seed or something like that we might see in other parts of the world when they're, you know, doing large-scale agriculture like this. So it's much easier to control pests. Hailstorms, right? So if you have a large weather event come in, or a big freeze, or something like that, you know, you always hear about the failing orange crops in Florida because there was a big freeze one year, or something like that. So that can, having these greenhouses also cancels out that loss to acts of God, if you were. So it's really a success story. There's some other things to look at. So corn, you know, corn is a global staple. One of the problems with corn is that it will grow each year, produces this head of corn, and then it dies. So in the course of 1 year, its roots don't go very deep, which is fine. As the corn lives, in October we harvest it, and that's the end. But there's actually some work being done in the realm of genetic modification. Usually I think we all have a knee-jerk reaction to say no to GMOs, but I think that the reality is a little more gray. So there has been some work to actually make corn a perennial plant, so a corn plant that wouldn't die every year and would have roots that are old, right? So, you know, your plant would be 10 or 15 years old, and the roots would be able to penetrate really deeply, meaning it's going to use less water, and the farmers wouldn't have to buy seed every year. And so, in particularly in places like Ethiopia, they're looking at growing some of this perennial corn, this corn that's been genetically modified not to die every year and to set down roots and come back every spring. And I think, again, you know, some of those technologies are how we can modify our carrying capacity. Okay, so week 5, the only thing you're going to have to do for week 5 is exam number 1. There'll be plenty of information out about that during the course of of week 4, I'll make sure that all that stuff is ready to go. There won't be any videos or assignments. I just want you to focus on that exam for that week. Okay? All right, well, I'll catch up with you week 6, and we're going to start talking about energy, right? We'll start with some of the fossil fuels, right? Each of those we're going to look at in depth. So, all right. Well, it's been a great week. Hopefully I'll see you soon. Good luck on the exam. Bye.